Hi folks, welcome. Another Tuesday evening. Nice to see everybody on and enjoying some of the banter. Just going into pre-show mode for a moment or two. We're just a little bit before the 8 p.m. watershed, so good to see everybody in. And of course, we're going to have a very interesting conversation with Robbie this evening about poodles, whose got the Poodle. Who's controlling the Poodle? Are we talking about the banks and how they control government, or are we talking about China and the US and how they control Australia? All those sort of different conversation points. I thought the Poodle analogy was quite neat. And talking about poodles, well, here's the doggies. They're there. They were woofing a second ago because we had the bins being emptied, but they're now quiet again. So hopefully they will stay quiet. And for those who are interested in the setup, maybe not seen it before, Robbie's there, teed up, ready to come in. And we have the normal system with the control panels and multi-view and the chat and everything else that's all set up, ready to run. So I think all is good. And we've now hit the 8 o'clock deadline. So that's also great. So I am going to take the pre-show off and I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 15th of July 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Really great to have you on this evening. Thank you very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. And this is going to be an important conversation again tonight, specifically touching some of those touchy political and also economic issues that we are in the middle of at the moment. And I've got Robbie, of course, to come on tonight and share some of his thoughts. And we're going to kick some of those big issues around AUKUS. We'll probably touch on the fact that Alba's in China at the moment, what's happening with the US, what's happening in Australia with the banks and what they're doing as well. Of course, it's all part of the question of who's pulling the strings. And we might even get on to Mr. Birmingham and his new role as well. A few issues we can talk about there. Just before I bring Robbie in, I should remind you that we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. It's a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, and suggestions in as we go. And if you'd like to ask a specific question of Robbie or myself, if you use that Walk the World, that'll get into my queue to make sure I see it. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always appreciated. Really helps us to cover some of the costs of what we do here. We don't do this for profit, just because it's a really important debate to be had at the moment, especially just now. Right, let me bring Robbie straight in. Robbie, welcome back.
Hi, Martin.
How are you?
Oh, well, flat out like a lizard drinking. We had a busy election, and then I think I breathed for a week, and then it's been back into it because the reason we're here and do what we do has not gone away.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I guess one of the interesting points of departure would be just briefly reflect on the election, which to my mind was an object lesson in pointlessness to an extent, insofar that the major issues that should have been discussed weren't discussed. We saw that in the ABC leak this week, where the Treasurer now has to recognise the fact that we've got big issues with the budget. We've got big issues with the 1.2 million, which is never going to be achieved in terms of housing. So at one level, it seemed to me that we had a bit of a false campaign on some very superficial issues. The other issue I've got is that the major parties were sort of chucking bricks at each other, but there was very little coverage, broader coverage that there should have been on some of the other parties and some of the other issues. And I know that you found that particularly difficult.
Well, the latter certainly. Like that was, and I'm not speaking my own book here. This was an election where, for the first time ever in history, the over 1/3 of Australians voted against the two major parties. So it was 33.6% voted against the two major parties. Yet the mainstream media coverage of the election was like a US presidential election.
Yep.
Dutton versus Albo. That's it. That's all people saw. It was as if that other reality didn't exist. Now, thanks to the bizarre features of our preferential voting system, Albanese ends up with this monster majority. It's the biggest Labor caucus in Australian political history now in Parliament. Absolutely monster majority. But it's on 34% of the vote. Right. Back in 1983, Bob Hawke won what was considered a big majority then of 82 or 83 seats. I can't remember. On 49.6% 6% of the vote, as close to 50 as you'll get. Albanese got 34% of the vote in this election, yet he ends up with this monster majority. And it just reinforced the media's perception that they can get away with covering elections like this. And why was there over 33% of the vote against the two major parties? Precisely because of what you just said. There were issues, fundamental issues affecting the country that the two major parties were not addressing, right? That's why people are voting away from the two major parties. And it will continue to grow. You know, what's the big one? The cancer that's at the heart of our economy, called the housing market, right? It's a cancer. It is not supporting, it is not growth that is supporting the economy. It is eating away at the economy. And they're heading for a demographic nightmare, because also for the first time, the younger cohort slightly outnumbered the older cohort, and that's going to continue to grow, right? And at a certain point, they will start voting for radical solutions to the housing market, because they're the ones that are locked out of it, right? And it will get radical, and that's the fault of this generation of politicians that we've got at the moment. And of course, there's other fundamental economic issues that get denied as well. But to me, that's the big one. And you try and force the system to address it, and it doesn't want to. So it just reinforces, well, okay, we're here to address that, right? This is why our party exists. We know that our purpose is important, but then it defines the challenge in a different way, in the sense that, okay, you've got to say, what do you need to do to break through this media sound wall so that you can get your message to the general public, because they're not going to help. You know, the media and the political establishment are certainly not going to help you. They're too tied up in this dying system that we've got.
So the question for me is democracy working, or is democracy not working?
Well, see, what do we call democracy? I think democracy by definition works because the government reflects the will of the people. The question is, do we have democracy, right? Or do we have a system that's rigged in so many ways with so many filters that it is no longer democratic? I keep using this word demographic. Sorry, I'm tired. It's essentially no longer democratic. We'll talk about this more later, Martin. But this is one of the reasons I get so furious at this international foreign policy debate about democracies versus autocracies. They can shove it up their ass, because I see how democracy works in Australia. And is America's any better? And we send our young men around the world to die for this steaming pile of shit that we call democracy, right? Where the will of the people is not getting expressed in the parliament. It's a joke. You know, whereas a country like China, let me tell you about China. Everybody in China gets to vote. Literally every adult in China gets to vote. And they've got something even better than a vote. They've got a hotline. There's this fantastic system in China with a hotline where if you have a problem, you call that hotline. And everybody gets to call the same hotline. There must be millions of people manning the other end. And the officials are bound to if you got a pothole that needs to be filled, someone will come and fill the pothole. Now, it might take a few days or weeks, but if everyone in the street calls and wants the pothole filled, it'll take seconds to do it, right? So it responds to the amount of demand that's out there. But this is a country that says we need to know what the people are thinking so we can respond to that. And yet we call them undemocratic because they don't have American-style presidential elections every 4 years. Well, shove it up your clacker, because I know what we've got here is not democracy, because we have a sick, broken economic system. We have a generation and another generation coming off of young people who are locked out of it, absolutely locked out of the most fundamental basic being able to access the most fundamental basic need they have, which is housing. And our system is capable of responding to that. You had one really strong voice in Parliament in the form of the Greens, Max Chandler Mather. And so what did they do? The two major parties combined to preference against him and make sure he wasn't in there anymore. because the Greens only got elected because the Liberals decided, at the last election, I will preference the Greens ahead of Labor. This time they said, oh, he's too annoying, we'll preference back, right? And so the two major parties, play those games, and that's called democracy. No, it's an utter joke. I did these figures, Martin, that the high watermark of the major party vote this century was 2008 with Kevin Rudd, and I think it got to 87% or something, combined vote. And since then, every single election, it has dropped to this time being over 1/3 of the vote, over 33%. And there's nothing to indicate that's not going to keep happening. That drop is not going to keep happening. In the seat right where I am, where we ran a good candidate, there was a record broken where the combined major party vote in this seat got to 46%. Combined major party vote. It's an all-time low in Australian history. That's a harbinger of the future.
And one of the things that I want to observe, Robbie, is the way that the control of social media and, the top down, we can't talk about this, we can't talk about that, you need to be able to get your ID in to be able to actually look at anything. What's happening is that rather than having vigorous open debates about these critical issues, which are very, very important for our future, it's being turned down, deliberately turned down, so that effectively there is actually less debate and less free speech than we've had previously. And to my mind, democracy and free speech are two sides of a single coin. And the more that you actually tune out and tune down the ability to be able to put ideas out there, then the more and more you effectively turn the system into something which is certainly not democratic. It might be playing the game and, the preferences, et cetera, but it's a political system designed to protect the current political system. It's not actually designed to provide better outcomes for ordinary Australians. And interestingly, of course, we have precisely the same issue in the UK, where effectively we had a similar distribution of votes, massive majority for one party. And now, of course, that party is completely stuffing up because they are not actually tackling the critical issues that people think are really important. And these issues are not insubstantive, right? The question of housing and how to solve the housing issue has been bubbling for 20 to 30 years. I made my first show in the year 2000 when I was talking to the ABC about the risks to the housing market in Australia because of bad government policy, right? Guess what? It all played out. And I remember in 2005 and 2006 going on 7:30 and talking specifically about the trap that was being laid for first-time buyers. Well, guess what? That trap has sprung. The point is, unless we can discuss some of these critical issues, then nothing is going to substantively change. And then, of course, the other side of the question, and which takes us into the Tonight Show about the Poodles, right? Well, who's pulling the strings, right? There are people who want the status quo to continue. There are people who actually believe that the current structure of society and the current economic structures are to their benefit. So the last thing they want to do is to move the dial around to anything that's different. And I can talk perhaps about the banks, and I can talk about those in the housing construction sector, and I can talk about the big financial players or the Qantases and the Coles. There's a long list of players who actually are benefiting quite nicely, thank you very much, from the way that things are currently running at the moment. So we have a really big, important structural question, which sort of takes us then to the poodle question, right? So, who's the poodle, who's controlling the poodle, and who should be controlling the poodle?
Well, I think I know the answer to who's the poodle. And the Australia, or especially the Australian government, I would say is a poodle to all the big, powerful vested interests. They're a poodle. Both parties, the Uni-party, are the poodle of all the corporate interests. That's why we don't have true democratic accountability in Australia. Because if you're going to have a democracy, you've got to have accountability. And where's the accountability? You elect these people into office, and then they do the bidding of people who are unelected, and that's these corporate power brokers. And then we'll talk about in foreign policy, where the poodle of a drunken, out of control, lurching state on the other side of the Pacific, and it's just our inability to extract ourselves from that is actually shocking. But just back to the banks, you know, a few weeks ago, it was quite shocking to learn what happened to Simon Birmingham. So Simon Birmingham was the finance minister in the Morrison government, who became when they lost office in 2022, he was the opposition leader in the Senate. And I was watching the last day of the Senate last year, and that was the day, remember, when they rammed through 40 bills in one day? And Jared Rennick told me that I think he said they voted something like 180 times in the day. And that just meant they spent the whole day standing up and sitting down, essentially, and shuffling the seats. Hardly any of the bills that they voted on did anyone know what they were voting for. And this was the government. But when the government combines with the opposition, they can ram these bills through. And then suddenly at 4 o'clock, despite having all these bills on their plate, they took the time out to pay this tribute to Simon Birmingham, because he suddenly announced he was retiring unexpectedly, with no notice. He's retiring. And you thought, oh, okay, well, and then you roll your eyes, oh yeah, where's he going to turn up? Well, we knew he was going to turn up somewhere. Well, now we know where he turned up. He's the new CEO of the Banking Association. He's the replacement for Anna Bligh. But we should have known. I pulled up the press release I wrote about this, Martin. We should have known from his speech where he was going, right? Because he didn't say, he said, I can't tell you where I'm going to go. He said it's a new career pathway that'll be in a new commercially oriented direction. And then he said this: you can all be relieved to know that it has nothing to do with lobbying, government relations, or commentary. And that just proved to be a straight out lie. He lied to the Australian Parliament, because I've no doubt he had the job lined up at the Banking Association. He'll deny it, but they're just liars. And the proof he had the job lined up at the Banking Association is what he said next. He decided to leave some advice to the Senate. He goes, we should also be clear that it's important to celebrate the profits of Australian companies, not undermine them. Now, that's someone rehearsing his lines as the CEO of the Banking Association, right? And then he added this. He goes, I found this one, the first one was shameless. This one was sinister. He goes, we should also be bold in the use of data to drive government efficiency and stare down the conspiracy theorists who jeopardize such productivity measures. Now, he said government data, but of course that could equally apply to the banks as well, which lead in the big data space to harvest everyone's data so they can monetize it and surveil literally everything we do, right? And of course that's the bank's excuse for this digital jihad they're on at the moment, closing branches and forcing people out of cash and into digital transactions, right? It's all productivity. Yeah, their productivity apparently not, but when you close bank branches is at the expense of the public's productivity. But there's an example where this is just the latest politicians shamelessly taking the revolving door to the private sector. Now, I'm going to I've drafted a letter to the NAC to refer Simon Birmingham's taking this job to the NAC, the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, can I say it's a bit of a publicity stunt, because there's no way the NAC... I referred Scott Morrison to the NAC over AUKUS at the start of last year on much stronger grounds, and the NAC turned that down. Now, it's nothing personal to me, because the NAC turns everything down. They're the most useless corruption watchdog in the history of the world, right? I've jumped on John Adams' bandwagon. We've got to sack Paul Brereton, the head of the NAC, and we should replace the whole damn thing. It's a joke. But I want the public to actually hear about this referral to the NAC, because this country is way too casual about this revolving door. And when I looked at it, I thought, well, how much is he going to get paid as the CEO of the Banking Association? And what I discovered is that the Banking Association does not disclose the salary of the CEO. Now, I was really struck by that, because I thought, well, hang on, all the members of the Banking Association are publicly listed banks. They're all on the stock market, and you know the salary of all their CEOs. But the salary of the CEO that they appoint to be their chief lobbyist, they keep secret. And given that we know they like employing ex-politicians who at a maximum as politicians, as ministers, would have earned, up to say $400,000, I think it's very relevant what they get paid by the Banking Association to be their chief lobbyist, because I reckon they get paid a lot. To see the way Anna Bligh danced like the organ grinder's monkey, right, since 2017 as the head of the Banking Association. She was the best cheerleader on earth. She earned her whatever they paid her. Absolutely. She got out there and lied like nobody's ever lied before, singing the praises of destroying country towns all around Australia by closing branches to say, oh, this is what they want. I mean, she was a Donald Trump style salesman, right? Being able to literally, piss on your leg and tell you it's raining kind of thing. That's what she did to country towns all around Australia for the time she was. So she earned her money. She well and truly earned her money. But what is that money? It's obviously enough to make them dance. But if you don't get to know what that is, except to know that, hang on, it's obviously pretty serious. You can't deny that this revolving door does not send a message to all sitting members of Parliament. Hey, toe the line, and you might get this chance as well. So when Muggins, me, and Martin North and Dale Webster comes along and says, hey, there's a problem here with country towns losing their branches, as we did, right? And we put all the analysis out there, etc. We got the inquiry up, and everyone's going, oh yeah, and they're listening to the stories from these country towns, and it's devastating, right? And everyone's trying to sound empathetic about it. But what actually ends up happening? Nothing, because they're not prepared to disrupt the system. That for a lot of them, the reason they're not prepared is they don't want to upset their future chances in that system, right? And this is corruption Australian style. There's no doubt in my mind that it's not corruption. And then just one final point on Simon Birmingham. I want to tell you that your viewers might have heard about the latest bank to decide to close a bunch of branches is Bendigo Bank. Now, Bendigo Bank, Martin, is running these ads, Bendigo, the better big bank. Somewhere along the line recently, Bendigo decided took the strategic decision, we're going to join the big bank club. We're going to identify as a big bank with the rest of the big banks. And then from their behavior, you have to conclude, well, maybe the criteria to be a member of the big bank club is to close branches, because they go and announce 10 bank closures last week, 5 of them in towns where it's the last bank in town, right? Just rip out the last bank in town, which was particularly devastating to those towns, trading on its reputation as the bank with the most community banks, which it built up its reputation back in the 90s, opening up all these community banks that the community pays for, by the way. Bendigo Bank doesn't pay for it. The community puts up the money for these community banks, but Bendigo gets all the good reputation of being the bank with the community banks. Bendigo's got over 200 branches around Australia, but most of them, well over half of them, are community banks. But it counts them all. It says, oh, look, we've got the biggest bank network outside the major banks. Yeah, because 140 country towns around Australia put up the money to open their own community bank. You just provide the banking services for it, right? But the banks that they control, they've now gone and shut 10 of them. One of them was in the country town of Yarram in Gippsland in Victoria, and the local member of Parliament, Darren Chester, went along to a community meeting about the bank closure. He was invited to the community meeting by the local stock and station agent, who was really mad at losing the branch, because just before he lost the branch, he had been informed that his account, Martin, had been moved to the next branch in the local bigger town, much further away. The trick that I think you were the first person to actually tell me about, this accounting trick that the banks were pulling. So they close down the biggest and most profitable accounts and move them to a bigger branch further away. And then they say, oh, look, this bank here is unprofitable, right? The total accounting trick. So he was furious about that. He organised a community meeting, got Bendigo Bank to come along, organised the local federal member of Parliament, Darren Chester, who is a former cabinet minister, to come along. And Bendigo Bank refused to let the member of Parliament in the meeting. The Bendigo Bank executives said they would leave if he entered the meeting. And so he had to stay outside. How goddamn arrogant are these banks? Well, the reason they're that arrogant and the reason Darren Chester can't ultimately do anything is because his colleague, who he had spent years sitting on the other side of the cabinet table from, Simon Birmingham, has just taken that bloody revolving door to go be the chief spruiker for the Banking Association. They know they run the system. They've got it wrapped up, right? And all, if the government is the poodle to the banks, then Simon Birmingham and Anna Bligh and these clowns that jump from the poodle to the bank can only be called one thing: the fleas, right? So they're the flea. He's the latest flea to jump onto the bank from the poodle, and they know they've got the system rigged. That's why they're so damn arrogant. And they know that there'll be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth in these towns, and the local media will cover it, etc. But fundamentally, nothing's going to change at the government level with the way the two major parties are oriented. There's poodle number one.
And it's just worth highlighting, we had the final report from that very long inquiry. You went through all the hearings and all of the out-of-town places, Tom Price and everywhere else, and they came in with some very good recommendations about fundamental structural change within the banking industry, including potentially a public bank, maybe attached to the post office. Normally, there would be a response. There has been no response from government over that time. And of course, what will happen is they'll eventually publish something which, it's now today. It's no point in responding. It's the classic yes minister, isn't it?
Well, Lisa, my wife, just the other day, she went and found the previous example of that to get a screenshot so we could publish a photo to show people that's exactly what they do. They'll dig up. So the law says they've got to respond in 90 days. They completely ignore that. That's an actual law. The governments of the day completely ignore that. And then 3 or 4 years later, they'll bring up all these Senate reports and they'll go through them and they'll just put the same line at the end of every recommendation. There's too much time passed. A response is irrelevant. And it's just a joke. Whereas what they're making a joke of is the very best thing about Australia's parliamentary system, in my experience. But it is the very, very best thing, because back to this question, what is democracy? Democracy is the will of the people. But you want the will of the people to be constantly conveyed to Parliament, right? So you want that feedback mechanism that allows the Parliament to understand the will of the people, but you also want the informed will of the people, such that, you and I, Martin, may have an opinion on, let me think. I don't know, the state of the field hockey sport in Western Australia, right? We may have an opinion about that. I mean, when I was a kid in Townsville, I grew up next to a family that played field hockey. So maybe I'll offer a casual opinion and say, yeah, I like watching at the Olympics. It'd be good if they do it. But the opinion that matters more are the people involved in that system who know the problems and challenges, and if they have an opportunity to explain that, present that to people in elected officials in government who can actually then learn something from that, right? Then that is a proper expression of the will of the people. And we achieved that with the branch closed inquiry. I've told this story before on your show. At the very last hearing in Tom Price in Western Australia, I got quite bold and I went up to one of the senators, Senator Richard Colbeck. Now, most people have heard of Richard Colbeck, but he was the aged care minister during COVID and he got absolutely slaughtered, right? And what the reason I'm mentioning that is there's always a difference between the caricature of a politician that's presented to you on television and what they're like in real life. Because the Richard Colbeck I had seen had attended more than half of the hearings of the branch closures inquiry, starting with the first one in Sale, and he was at the Tasmanian one because he's from Tasmania, and he went to a bunch of them, but not all of them like me. So I got to see the ones he attended, and I got to see the kinds of questions that he asked. And at the Tom Price one, I said, I don't mean to sound patronising, Senator, but you've gotten better. And he didn't take offence. I thought he might. I didn't care if he would. I'm like that, but I thought he might take offence, but he didn't. He said, when you start an inquiry like this, you're a tabula rasa, you're a blank slate. You genuinely don't know what you're about to be exposed to. But then you absorb so much, you learn so much, because you have these hearings and all these people are coming up and they're giving testimony, and they're very passionate, and they're explaining to you what's going on. That is what we did in that inquiry. Senator Matt Canavan, who was the chair, started off as, Mr. Nice Guy in the first hearing. By the 13th hearing, he was a roaring lion up there in Tom Price, because Bankwest had just, again, completely arrogantly, in the middle of this inquiry, announced that they were going to close all their branches and make them digital, be a completely digital bank, right? And so Matt Canavan in that last hearing, he reminded me of a Southern, American prosecuting attorney in a movie, right? Just destroying the witness on the stand. He was that good. I was blown away, right? One day, if I get time, I'm going to turn the audio. There's only audio that one. You didn't get to see a video of it, but he just took their heads off, because he wasn't going to let them bullshit him because of what he had sat through for 13 hearings, right? He knew that this was devastating to these towns, and he wasn't going to let these pinstripe Bank West executives tell him otherwise. And so that's the mindset that produced this brilliant report, devastatingly brilliant report with really, really good recommendations. 1, declare access to banking services and cash an essential service. That's a legal designation, which puts the responsibility on the banks and on the government. If the government says access to banking is an essential service, it's got to make sure that essential service is provided as well. 2, convene an expert panel to investigate the feasibility of a public bank, including a postal bank, which was, our baby, right? The Citizens Party's policy campaign for a postal bank, which is why we're involved. 3, make the banking code of practice mandatory instead of voluntary. Make it actually mandatory. And there was a bunch of other recommendations, including ones from Andy Schmulo, who was our Senate candidate in the last election. This is how I got to know Andy. His recommendations were devastatingly effective, and they were all adopted as well. And so this was a well-considered, well-thought-out package of reforms, and the government has ignored them. And then blow me down, did we recently discover, just the other day, how right in the middle of this Senate inquiry, Anthony Albanese had gone on a podcast here in Melbourne in August 2023, and he gave the best possible argument in favour of a public bank. He said to Neil Mitchell, in August 2023, he said he would not have privatised the Commonwealth Bank. He said, you need a public institution there to keep the private institutions honest. And Neil Mitchell said, what, you think a public bank would have kept the bank, made the banks behave better, instead of having the Royal Commission? And Anthony Albanese said, yeah, the competitive tension from the public bank is what forces the banks to improve their behaviour. That's what he said. I mean, he expressed in 2 or 3 sentences the whole gist of our argument for a public bank right there. He's the Prime Minister of Australia. He's the guy that we're asking to respond to this report. So in a sense, we know he agrees with it. We know he agrees with it, Martin. But nothing. Radio silence. It's like he is incapable of acting on something with all the power he's supposed to have, acting on something he knows to be right. And that is what tells you that there's this, I called it like the media sound wall or whatever when it comes to the media, but it's like this force field around what we call democracy to limit what it can do, so that, if it's a non-important issue, a minor issue, yeah, you'll get some action on it. But if it's fundamental change that has far-reaching consequences for a vested interests, such as a public bank, such as reforming the housing market, democracy doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's really the point. And unfortunately, of course, well-paid politicians can move into other jobs. Christopher Pyne into the defence industry, ScoMo into the defence industry, a lot of other people going into the banking industry, wherever you look. But ordinary businesses and ordinary Australians, of course, are left holding the baby, because they are the ones who now can't get access to banking services in regional parts of Australia. They are people who are having to pay a lot more than previously just to access the banking system. or drive a long way if they would need to go somewhere. And of course, the banks say, "Oh, well, it's your problem, not our problem." They've outsourced all of the issues. So there's a real mismatch again between the outcomes. So the few, the wealthy few, those who are in the political system and those who actually benefit from it, seem to do very well. The big corporates are doing very well. If you look at the CBA share price, it's still extremely high, and people can't understand why it's so high. Well, it's partly because, of course, it's a protected species, protected by the way that the banks are, well, influencing everything that's going on, and of course have a huge investor base, most of whom, by the way, are overseas. So a lot of that money goes offshore rather than feeding back into Australia. So the problem is we've got this disparity between the many and the few, and yet the democratic process seems to skew it in a way that means we can't get the outcomes that would actually benefit ordinary people. And that's, for me, the real outcome. So in this case, the politicians are the poodle, and effectively, you can see Birmingham stroking the poodle, or whatever, or you could sort of imagine some of the other large corporates, the gas sector being a fantastic example, right?
Yeah.
Nutty example where they're still charging absolute top dollar. And whilst Albo can talk about, well, maybe we should do something here, and maybe there's, gas renovation, etc., nothing ever gets done. So effectively, Australians are paying absolute top dollar for energy. That's the marginal price of electricity, which means that the CPI is higher. That then means that governments need to actually hand taxpayer money back to people to try and keep the CPI down a bit, to try and force the RBA to cut rates, despite the fact that the RBA saw through it and didn't cut rates. So you can see how these things just snowball, and we end up then in this morass of stupidity. The problem, of course, always is that it's ordinary people who are actually ending up, with the damp end of the stick again.
Now, I've got a little bit of good news, Martin, because Tassie may be riding to the rescue. And what I mean by that is there's an election on in Tasmania at the moment, and the single most interesting thing in Australian politics for many years has come out of that election. Jeremy Rockliff, the Premier, who I happened to meet during our election campaign. I was down there, actually, and I happened to meet him at an event. They reopened the Tasmania branch of the Australia-China Business Council, and I was invited as a guest along there because even though I don't have any business in China. I'm the guy who's been saying for 5 years, why are we sabotaging our business in China? Anyway, put that aside. So I got to meet Jeremy Rockliff, but that's not what he announced. He announced that, and he said it was the most important election announcement in the election. He announced that Tasmania is going to bring back a state insurance company.
Yep.
And on the one hand, cue the outrage. And the outrage is from the Insurance Council of Australia, which represents all the insurance companies. And as I'm sure you know, despite however many insurance companies you see advertised, there's really only 3 and a bit that own the whole lot. So there's 3, the sector, like every other important economic sector in Australia, and this is the problem with Australia, every important economic sector is dominated by just a handful of corporations: banks, insurance companies, gas companies, airlines, supermarkets, auditors, etc. Right? That's the concept. They're all oligopolies, and there's no real competition. And so the Insurance Council of Australia, they of course scramble to say, "Oh, this is going to put the risk on the taxpayer of Tasmania." That's as if that's their main concern. Their main concern, of course, is their profits. But I tell you what was impressive, and I just wrote this up today, actually, that's why it's fresh in my mind. All the key industry groups in Tasmania, about the real economy industry groups, they all applauded it because insurance costs have gone up 35% in the last couple of years. This will bring down insurance premiums by at least 20%, right? And they know that these things are a game changer. And we did a report in our publication a couple of years ago now, and someone like Jared Rennick likes to talk. We always talk about a public bank, but trust me, we believe a public insurance company is just as important. But when I say just as important, it has a slightly different role. Jared likes to say, you can combine the two, and you absolutely should. But every state in Australia used to have government insurance officers. They're called GIOs, state government insurance officers. Tassie had one, TGIO, and WA had one, and Queensland had one, SGIO. We wrote up, we got the information from Trove, the online resource for the old newspapers in Australia. You can actually find this fascinating stuff. When Queensland started its state government insurance office in 1917, they did something extraordinary. They increased the benefits that people got paid out when they made a claim of insurance by 75%. They upped them by 75% without raising the premiums. And then they thought this worked so well, they could actually lower the premiums. Because if you operate insurance without a profit motive, right, just make enough profit to cover the cost of administration, where you got, a pool of money flowing in from the premiums, but you're only paying out to the claimants. You're not having this big siphoning it out for profits. You can actually insure a lot more people than these private insurance companies tell you now for a lot less cost, right? But somehow that's bad because that's socialism, they'll say. And of course, so the reaction of the Insurance Council of Australia will tell you that's a micro example of what we're going to get if we actually get a government to talk about a public bank. They, cue the outrage. They will squeal like they're being shot. But the fact that Tasmania's government, Liberal government no less, has said this is what they need. The edifice of neoliberalism that we saw in our lifetime build up is now completely crumbling, right? And so it's, there's a long-term democratic process which is not the way democracy is supposed to work. It's supposed to be more responsive to the system is supposed to be more responsive to the actual needs. But despite those deficiencies, there's a long-term democratic process which is more undeniable, right? Which over time they realize, hang on, this system is failing. We can't pretend it isn't anymore. We better actually come up with some solutions. And if this is the beginning of something that spreads around it, because that's what the Insurance Council of Australia will be afraid of. Not that Tasmania will start taking away their profits, because Tasmania is a small market. It's just that will catch on. And if that catches on, right, then a bank will soon follow. And then we'll be happy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is worth, I think, highlighting that around the world, of course, there was a massive privatization run in the 80s and the 90s. The UK led off on it. And look what happened to they stuffed up the railways, they stuffed up the power industry, they stuffed up the steel industry, because the problem is that when your profit motivation leads everything else, then effectively you end up with nutty outcomes. And of course, this is the whole issue of let the markets be the markets, and you can't actually allow governments to do anything. They should just get out of the way, as it were. And we know now that actually is a very flawed way of thinking. And we see it left, right, and centre, because, of course, the profit motive leads to everything. And all the analysis has shown that when you actually have profit in the mix, then your overall fees have to go up a lot more. You have chief executives rewarded on profit increase and therefore share price increase, not on service to customers, which takes us right back into the banks and the insurance sector and other sectors too. So we know that neoliberalism is part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and yet people both in Treasury and in government are still wedded to neoliberalism as a way of thinking. And it's interesting that more and more, even now with the current situation in the UK, for example, the government is very, very iffy at getting more involved in doing things directly. They want to sort of do more private partners with players, right? Because we can't afford to do it ourselves. Well, that's because you've stuffed up already, and just effectively saying we're going to do more of the same old and expect a different outcome is just plain stupid. Let's move the conversation on, because we could talk about Poodles inside Australia, and there's clearly a whole show there. But look, the other side of it is Australia is a poodle, and that poodle on one hand is being petted on the head by the US, or not petted on the head now, but previously. But we've also got China looking over our shoulder too, and of course China being our biggest trade partner. And interestingly, just to give people a little bit of context here, that this data point's quite interesting. That China actually rode the trade chaos with record exports. Guess what? Some of those were actually, connected to what was going back and from Australia as well. So there's a really interesting argument here. And part of this is, up until now, the political ambience in Australia is we have to be very, very close to the US, and in fact, we have to sort of almost kowtow to the US. Sure, we have this relationship with China, but we'll only, do that on a trade basis. But now that is, I think, being questioned. In fact, there's a poll which I put up before we started, and people might want to put their answers in. I asked the question, Australia should maybe pivot towards the US, or pivot more towards China, or look beyond China and the US, or deliberately own our own destiny. At the moment, own our own destiny is 59%. So there's a sense from the people on the stream, at least tonight, that actually we should be owning our own destiny more. Let's unpack this a bit more, Robbie. Let's start with the US, right? And we have to come to AUKUS, because AUKUS is probably, to me, the exemplar of the problem. And of course, if you haven't been following the news, the US is now looking at AUKUS, this amazing stupid deal that was done some time ago. And Elbridge Colby is leading the review, the Undersecretary of Defence for Policy. He's an AUKUS skeptic. And as the BBC put it, could Trump sink Australia's submarine plans? Now, of course, Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull, who've been very critical of AUKUS, said, well, this is probably a good opportunity to really think hard about this. Even Sam Logren said, who's the lead security program at the Australia's Lowy Institute, said, I don't think any Australian would feel that our ally is fully committed to our security at the moment, right? So let's just explore the AUKUS disaster first, and what this means. It's putting a target on Australia and particular areas of Australia, and it's a huge amount of money, 368, is it? I don't know what the latest number is. Yeah. $1 billion. And now the US has come back and said, well, we'll have to charge you more, give us more, and we also want you to give us a commitment that actually you can use these boats vis-a-vis our outing into Taiwan if in fact we actually decided to go that route. Crazy.
Absolutely crazy. And let's come at this in a slightly different way, because I want to highlight something that happened a few weeks ago. It started off when Israel bombed Iran out of the blue, and then, of course, a week or so later, Trump bombed Iran, and there was this deliberate deception of Iran, where the Iranians thought they had a negotiation underway, and the Israelis first bombed the negotiators, and then Trump did his bombing. Now, by any measure of any reading of international law, what the Israelis did, but no one expects anything different, unfortunately. But what Trump did was a breach of international law, and a breach, of course, of his promise to his base. And the reason I'm raising this is because of the Australian government's reaction. So there were two parts to it. One was the Australian government did not want to own up to the obvious question that it kept being asked. Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong, they were being asked, was Australia complicit in this attack, in this breach of international law? And the reason I didn't want to own up to it because the answer is no. It was to ask the question is to answer it. Of course we were. And we were complicit in more than one way. The most obvious way is Pine Gap in the middle of Australia has become such an important US facility, and it's involved in the targeting of all kinds of attacks, including what goes on in Ukraine when the Ukrainians use American weapons with American guidance to bomb into Russia. That's Pine Gap. Malcolm Fraser, when he wrote his book, the late Prime Minister of Australia, when he wrote his book Dangerous Allies in 2014, highlighted then, because he wrote it in 2014, what was sort of a shocking new thing at that time to the world, which was how much Obama, when he became president, just ramped up the drone campaign to kill Al-Qaeda terrorists, the same Al-Qaeda they were backing in Syria to overthrow Assad, but in Pakistan and Yemen, they were raining down, hellfire from the skies, where the kids in places like Pakistan and Yemen learned to fear clear days because the drones were so high up you couldn't ever see them, but that's when they could be spotted and killed. And Malcolm Fraser highlighted that they used to use this double tap technique, that they drop the bomb on a target, people would rush in to help the victims, and then drop another one to get those people as well, right? And Pine Gap was involved in all of that. And that's why Malcolm Fraser at the time called for the closure of Pine Gap. And I like referring to Malcolm Fraser because Malcolm Fraser and Paul Keating, they should be understood as representative of an older generation view that finds what's happening in Australia now unthinkable and inexplicable. So the government didn't want to answer that. They didn't want to own up to that at all, because, of course, then there's moral implications for that. And the second thing, Martin, is they didn't want to condemn the United States for breaching international law. They refused to. You could not bring the Australian government to condemn them. And so what that reaction by Australia proved is that the 3 years since March 2022, when the Russians went into Ukraine, where Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese could not open their mouths without condemning the unprovoked, immoral attack on Ukraine, that was all for show. There was never any moral out. That was all affected, right? They weren't truly, from a principled standpoint, condemning Russia for going into Ukraine. All that's happened is our country has picked a side. That's all it is. We've picked a side. Because if international law is important, then you uphold international law. But of course, the world doesn't work that way anymore. Unfortunately, the UN system has been completely undermined from what it was set up to be, where people could actually see, okay, at least that defines what international law is. We're now back to an anarchy where the United States has made it absolutely clear, and it had already made it clear before Trump. Trump has just taken off the last fig leaf, right? Where he doesn't care about international law and he doesn't care about domestic law either, right? And he's just trying to get away with pulling the wool over his supporters' eyes about Jeffrey Epstein, which looks like it's blown up in his face as well, but we don't have time to go into that. So here's a thing that gives you an insight into Australia's relationship with the United States, that we can be this moralizing little upstart on the world stage when it comes to everybody else except the United States. So then, how did we get AUKUS? We got AUKUS under secret negotiations that started with the first Trump administration and Scott Morrison and Boris Johnson. They hatched the AUKUS plan. Now, the guy in the first Trump administration that Morrison was negotiating with was not Donald Trump. It was Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo, I like to point out that Mike Pompeo, Scott Morrison, and Boris Johnson are all completely discredited ex-politicians now. They're a joke in all their countries, right? Trump refused to employ Mike Pompeo. Scott Morrison is just an absolute blithering yahoo, and Boris Johnson is a bloviating buffoon, right? Yet these are the people who hatched up this scheme. But the reason we have it is because of Anthony Albanese's cowardice. One dark night, down a dark alley, over the barrel of a gun, Scott Morrison forced Anthony Albanese to agree to AUKUS. And it was literally like that. He gave him 24 hours and said, you got to agree in 24 hours to this, or else it's not going to happen. And we'll never know what Anthony Albanese really thinks, because he'll never admit it, maybe on his deathbed. But he only did it. Paul Keating was right. He only did it because he was too scared that Morrison would say he was weak on national security. Even though in the election that followed, and then in the last election, he towed up both guys that tried to beat their chest and call themselves tough on national security, and Anthony Albanese was weak. He beat them both. So if that's not a lesson for him to start growing a pair and show some spine here, right, he'll never get a better chance. But anyway, so we got AUKUS, and he signed up to this $368 billion deal. And then lo and behold, even after he rammed it through, he didn't even ram it through his caucus. The caucus had no say in it. Caucus members have admitted they were never allowed to discuss AUKUS in the caucus. There was no discussion of AUKUS in the caucus. he's signed Australia up to this, and then all these ex-politicians like Morrison, like Christopher Pyne, like Joe Hockey, Arthur Sinodinos, Joel Fitzgibbon, they're all war pigs now with their snouts in the trough, all of AUKUS, right? And everyone's having a whale of a time. The Indonesians said, well, hang on, you've started an arms race in this region, right? You negotiated this thing in secret, you started an arms race. What are you doing? And then we're going around saying, oh, see, everyone in the region accepts it. No, they don't accept it. The Indonesians have said so. You're just ignoring that. And then, of course, if China says anything, well, that's all self-serving. So that doesn't matter. The important thing about AUKUS, though, Martin, is what one of the deputy of ASPI. Now, ASPI is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and Alex Bristow is the deputy director of ASPI. He's a Brit who's come over here. And ASPI is funded by the Americans and the British and the Japanese government and others. And we have talked about ASPI for a long time because they have been this US-funded propaganda outfit to make Australians hate and fear our number one trading partner, China. And the deputy director of ASPI actually said, Alex Bristow said, that the role of ASPI was all important in AUKUS because unless they forced Australians to discuss China and see the threat that China is, Australians would never have accepted AUKUS. That was an admission that that's what the propaganda was for. The propaganda of fear about China is so that we would be prepared to spend exorbitant amounts to buy these weapons. And it's the craziest thing ever. Now, there's details about the deal that I'm sure most people are familiar with, but the most important detail is despite the price tag, both the Americans and the British have the right to pull out. And when they do, they could pull out today. They could pull out on the 39th year without delivering the submarines. When they do, if and when they do, we don't get our money back. And this is why people like Malcolm Turnbull have come out criticising it. It is actually just the deal itself is crazy. We've been handing over billions of dollars already to both the British and the Americans, and so they can build up their defence industry capability to produce these submarines. And we get none of that back. Now, the Americans have a review underway, and Donald Trump may end up be the one to save us from AUKUS despite ourselves. The British have a parliamentary inquiry into AUKUS. Conspicuously, the only country that hasn't had an inquiry, and right now refuses to, though we're trying to change that, is the only country that's paying. The one member of the partnership that's paying for it, we haven't had an inquiry into it. So our party is working with other parties like the Greens, etc. We are demanding an inquiry. The Teals have got on board. But if Labor and the Liberals both side on this and refuse to have an inquiry, because democracy, what's that? Right? When the two major parties act as a uni-party, there is no democracy in Australia. They could squash this whole thing. And then we will be dependent on what America says in relation to its inquiry. So this is what's got to change. Now, Parliament sits next week. And for the there's a first fortnight sitting, and then it's coming back at the end of August. But people should pay attention to this question because you will hear the drumbeat of demands for an AUKUS inquiry. And if the two major parties combine to block it, right, understand that this uni-party anti-democratic system has fundamentally kicked in. The final thing you mentioned there is now though what's most relevant, because the American language about AUKUS lays bare what the whole thing was all about. This AUKUS is entirely emblematic of the fact that Australia doesn't have sovereignty anymore, because the Americans are saying, well, okay, pay us more money. That's probably what Trump's thrown in there, right? He doesn't necessarily like AUKUS either, but if we give him more money, he will. And you can't rule out the Australian politicians will hold the line on that if they're that pathetic. The second thing, though, is what Elbridge Colby said. Well, we need a guarantee that you will make the submarines available for us in a war with China. In other words, if we take possession of those submarines from America, we will not have a choice to stay out of a war with China, even though in a war with China, as John Lander, the former ambassador that I've interviewed repeatedly, warns, Ukraine, we need to learn the lesson from Ukraine, because the way a proxy war works is the two actual antagonists, and in Ukraine it's NATO and Russia, or America and Russia. They will scrupulously avoid attacking each other directly, because that brings the danger of an escalation that may go nuclear. So all the attack is focused on the proxy. And if we agree to this Elbridge-Colby demand, we become the proxy along with Taiwan, maybe Japan, but Japan so far has made, the way it's talking, it's too smart for that. In fact, I've heard people say bluntly, the only country dumb enough in the Asia Pacific to allow itself to be used by the Americans in a war against China is Australia. Right? The Japanese, they were much more resolute in their response to Elbridge-Colby than we've been. We will make ourselves the target. It'll be a war of annihilation against Australia. The submarines won't save us one bit. It'll be a joke, but the Americans may or may not achieve their strategic objective. Doesn't matter. They won't pay the consequences, because China will be very reluctant to attack them directly. Australia will suffer the consequences, not because China hates us, not because China's not going to even invade us. They'll just send a swarm of missiles down here and blow the smithereens out of everything, especially places like Pine Gap, probably, because that's the war that America is trying to set up, and we will be the forward base staging ground for that war. That's what AUKUS actually means for Australia. And we have to decide, are we really that scared of China? Do we hate China that much? Are we really that much enamored by the United States? Do we think the American system is so great and wonderful and the high watermark of human evolution that we would sacrifice ourselves as a nation to be America's pawn in a war where America hopes it will destroy a country, not because it sees that country as a threat, actually, but because it sees it as a rival, and it refuses to accept a world where America has any rivals? Is that what Australia is willing to countenance? That's the question we need to look at.
Absolutely. And it's worth, I think, highlighting also that more broadly, Albo, of course, has not been able to meet Trump. And there are a number of people who are saying, hang on a moment, Albo, why aren't you in the US talking to Trump rather than actually in China talking to the Chinese? But there's an interesting polarization going on at the moment. But the AUKUS is really the linchpin, isn't it? Because effectively Australia is on the hook for a very large amount of money over a very long period of time without any guarantee of anything at all being delivered, first point. But secondly, it's putting the target on Australia. And that's the thing that I think people need to understand. And by the way, the lesson from Ukraine is that the war of the future will be drone-driven, AI-driven, aerial. You almost say, well, hang on a moment, just tell me again how subs actually play into this, because it's going to be a small number of subs if we get them ever, and they can only make a couple in the US, and they're way behind, and so they've got issues in terms of building. And of course, the interim step is to build a base in Australia that the US can then use in Australia. That's the other part of the story.
Well, one of the things we're trying to do with an AUKUS inquiry is to actually expand it. But if we get an inquiry up, then we, the Citizens Party, will, because when they do the terms of reference, hopefully they add, any related matters, right? We want the inquiry to also cover what's called the Forced Posture Agreement, and specifically the role of Pine Gap, because Pine Gap is a fascinating story in its own right. Gough Whitlam, on November 11, 1975, Gough Whitlam's agenda was announced, standing up in Parliament announcing that Pine Gap, the lease on Pine Gap would not be continued when it expired, that the Americans would be asked to close Pine Gap down. That was what he was on. That was on his agenda on the 11th of November 1975. It never happened, because you know what did happen on the 11th of November 1975? He got sacked. And the Governor General at the time, look it up, I won't go through all the details, was a person who, from World War II onward, was heavily involved with US intelligence. Now, but since the real thing is the forced posture agreement. Until 2011, all through when World War II ended, the Americans pulled out of Australia. They pulled out of the whole of the Asia Pacific, well, where they left, except where they left their bases. But they pulled out of Australia. We had no American military presence, military bases in Australia from 1945 until, well, the end of World War II, maybe not exactly 1945, until 2011. No Australian government in that whole time would accept an American military base in Australia. And the reason why, Martin, is because if you have a military base in your country, a foreign military base, you've lost some of your sovereignty. That country has a base there for its security, not your security. The way it defines its security. Now, Venn diagrams may mean there's a bit of an overlap, and so it suits that country as well, and it'll tell you, oh, that's for your security as well. But fundamentally, if it's not for its security, then it's not going to be there, right? So, and so the country with the base loses some sovereignty. And so every government in Australia, and I want your audience to consider this, think long and hard about what we've come to accept as normal now in the space of a few short years compared to what literally every single government from 1945 to 2011 refused to accept. Ben Chifley, Robert Menzies, Harold Holt, John Gorton, Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser, Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, John Howard, Kevin Rudd, until Julia Gillard. And I remember, this is an aside, just a casual observation. I remember when Barack Obama visited Australia and Gillard was Prime Minister. Gillard had this flat drone voice. She had the most deadpan delivery of any politician in Australian history. It was, she was a well-spoken person, but there was nothing exciting about the way she talked. When she announced that America would be allowed to put a military base in Darwin for a rotation of US Marines, she came out from a back room with Obama and gave a press conference, and her voice was quavering. I heard her voice quavering. He had either excited her in that back room or he had frightened her. Something had happened, but she had a quavering voice. She was destabilized when she made that announcement, and who knows what that actually was. But that's a really strong memory I have of that day. She began this. She agreed with Obama that they're going to station the Marines in Darwin. Now, can I point out for there are one or two xenophobes who may be left among your regular listeners, Martin? I'm sure there's not many because they love me so much. They all agree with me now. Can I point out that the litany of anti-China claims that we get bombarded with all the time, that was just put on repeat so that people were told to just through sheer repetition, brainwashed to accept China was a threat, always started off with China is building up military bases in the Asia islands as military bases in the Asia Pacific. That did not start until 2013. That was a response to Australia allowing what was called the tip of the spear, the US Marines, to be based in Darwin within Kui of the Straits of Malacca, the most important trading route in the world, sea route in the world, through which China's oil supply came from the Middle East. That the Marines in Darwin have a capability now to choke the Straits of Malacca and choke that off. And so in response to that, the Chinese started building up the islands, and so did the Taiwanese, and so did the Vietnamese, and so did the Filipinos. But all we were told is, oh, look, the proof of Chinese aggression is that they're building up islands in the Pacific. No, they were responding to our allowing America to once again project its power, but this time, for the first time, on our soil. And that's when we began to give up our sovereignty. Now, in 2014, the Abbott government consolidated that with a treaty with the Americans called the Force Posture Agreement. And that treaty basically means that for American military bases in Australia, They get to do what's designated American military base. They get to do what they like in that base. And I'll give you an example of that. There's a place in Darwin called the Port of Darwin. Now, the Port of Darwin is not the whole harbour of Darwin. It's one bloody well-organised jetty in the harbour of Darwin, right? It is not a security risk to Australia by any means. But, right next door, there's an American facility. And there was a scandal a few months ago because the Americans built these massive fuel storage units, and there's about 7 of them or something they built there, without permission from the Darwin government, from the Darwin Council. Without your basic permission that every other entity that wants to build something like would have to have, the Americans didn't bother because they don't have to. They're governed by the Forced Posture Agreement. When they're in town, they are the top dog. Don't kid yourself. And no local politician, let alone a state politician or a federal politician, is going to stand up to them and take it and take them on over this kind of stuff. So this forced posture, under this Forced Posture Agreement, the Darwin rotation is now permanent and bigger. You've got B-52 bombers stationed now in the Northern Territory as well. You've got B-2 bombers stationed in Annerley in Brisbane, and we're going to have the American submarines, America's operated submarines in Fremantle, and then supposedly the Virginia-class submarines that we own, and then supposedly others. But it's going to be an American submarine base over there in Fremantle, governed by the same Forced Posture Agreement. This happened before AUKUS, right? AUKUS is on top of that. And when you have such a military buildup like this in this country, you've got to say, well, what's it for? And what's it for is they're going to make China a threat, whether China likes it or not. Because the way to make someone a threat is you become so threatening yourself that then the equation becomes who hits first and has the advantage. Now, because I raised that, let me tell you something about what's happening right now in China. You would have seen, Martin, that this same Elbridge Colby that you quoted a second ago, he has said that he's demanding Australia and Japan actually clarify to the United States how we would support the United States in a war over Taiwan. Now, first of all, it's insanity, not least because America itself doesn't clarify if it's going to go to war with China over Taiwan. It's called strategic ambiguity. That's America's doctrine. It has never guaranteed that it will go to war with China over Taiwan. It never has, right? So what Colby is doing is just crazy, but it's not crazy if you know Colby. Colby is the grandson of a CIA director, William Colby, who died in very suspicious circumstances, actually. His grandfather might have been half okay. He wrote a book about 4 years ago called The Strategy of Denial, which is all about, because he's obsessed with China. He wants America to end all the support for Ukraine and whatever. We've got to focus on China. China's the big threat. Why? Because China's the only country that can rival the United States. So he's obsessed with that. He wrote this book where he said the only way America has a chance to actually defeat China, is if it can provoke China into striking Taiwan first. Because if it can provoke China into striking Taiwan, then America would be calculating that there would be a moral backlash among all of China's neighbors at this act of aggression by China. And that moral backlash could be harnessed to recruit those countries into siding with America and actually fighting alongside America against China in such a war. And then America might have a chance. And it comes down to provoking the Chinese into that first strike. The other day, we published an article in our publication just totally debunking this idea that is just that idiotic bloody journalists like on Sky News just repeat as if it's proven gospel that Xi Jinping has said China needs to be ready to invade Iran by 2020, to invade Taiwan by 2027. He has never said that. And what do they think? He's stupid? who actually forecasts in advance when they're going to conduct an invasion? Like the way they want Australians to think Chinese are blithering idiots is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, they think these journalists and their string pullers, they think we're the blithering idiots to believe this stuff. But unfortunately, a lot of people are. China's never said that. This has been idle American speculation all along. Some stupid Dr. Strangelove general in a US congressional hearing in 2020 was asked, when do you think China might be ready to invade Taiwan? He said, I don't know, 7 years' time or something like that, right? And that became the timeline that everyone has responded to ever since. Xi Jinping even took this up with Joe Biden a few years ago, saying, why do you keep saying this? There's no plan by China to do anything like that. I'm going to get crude here. A Chinese person said to me when I was discussing this with them, he said, why would we invade Taiwan? He said, the way we think about it is it's like, if you love a woman, would you rape her? No, you would woo her, right? China wants Taiwan back. Taiwan is a province of China. They're all related to each other. China desperately wants Taiwan back, but doesn't want to destroy Taiwan to get it back. China is a 5,000-year-old civilization. It's capable of playing the longest game of all time. The rise of China has made China increasingly attracted to the Taiwanese. But it's all this other stuff that comes along that the Americans help stir up, because the Chinese have said for 50 years, there's one red line: they will not tolerate Taiwan declaring independence because America asked them to. That's when they will go to war, because that will be a war like a civil war, which is exactly the legal status of the conflict anyway. There was a civil war that stopped in 1949 because the communists won on the mainland, and the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, and the communists didn't pursue them. So it's like an interrupted civil war. But if those Taiwanese declare independence, that's secession. Abraham Lincoln, revered as the greatest of American presidents, started a war that killed the most Americans in any war, the Civil War. 640,000 Americans died in that war to stop the South seceding. And China will do the same thing. It's not going to tolerate secession from the Taiwanese. It just will not. China does not bully Taiwan. Cut the crap. It just doesn't do it. You are told China bullies Taiwan. But then what's America, whoever said that, what's America doing to us? America is bullying us all over the place. And I just wrote an article today making the point, well, when you see the kind of speeches that Albo gives and Penny Wong gives, they're always very blunt in the way they talk about China, the country we're supposedly afraid of. They are so afraid to offend the United States. Trump is coercing us, he's bullying us, he's insulting us. And our politicians, like the lapdog Poodle, going, yes, 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 yes. And then we're told that China is bullying Taiwan. No, all China is doing to Taiwan is keeps repeating the line. There are pro-independence people in Taiwan, and if they get silly because America is whipping them up, China will say, okay, we told you, you will not declare independence because that is our red line. There is one China. Every country in the world agreed there's one China. We will go to war over that. And it wouldn't be happening if the Americans weren't stirring it up. And this is, now, my final point on this. Sorry, I've gone on a bit long because I want to make a point. People might think Robbie's a panda hugger, Mr. What Cookie Boy called me years ago, Chairman Barwick, Mao, etc. I've never been to China, but I'm going for the first time in October, by the way. Looking forward to it. If I was Prime Minister, what would I do? They say, you'd become a province of China, and that's all crap. I'm a proud Australian. All I'm saying Australia should do in relation to this right now, especially in response to Elbridge Colby, and I think Albanese should do it while he's in China right now. He should do no differently than John Howard and Alexander Downer did in 2004. That's all he needs to do. In 2004, Alexander Downer was in Beijing. And that was a time when America was saber-rattling over Taiwan as well, because the Taiwanese president at that time was, flirting with the concept of independence. And the Chinese said, no, you will not, right? You be Taiwan, but you're not going to declare yourself independent. And Bush was helping to fan that a bit. And so Downer, now Alexander Downer was as big a US sycophant as you will ever see. You know, if you don't go back and look at the way he used to justify the Iraq War. And of course, Howard was the golden boy to Washington. Howard had committed us to that evil war just for the sake of the US alliance. These people were pro-US loyalists in running our country. But, you know, at the time, they were building up the resource deals with China, and they knew that Australia did have its own independent national interests, and they were prepared when it mattered to assert that under certain circumstances. And 2004 was a case in point. And so Alexander Downer was asked at that time, would Australia support America in a war over Taiwan? And his reply was, America should not assume Australia's support in a conflict over Taiwan, because the ANZUS pact we have with America only obliges us to consult with America if either America or Australia is attacked. It does not oblige us to do anything in relation to a war with a third party. That's what Downer bluntly said while he was in Beijing to the Americans in response to that question. And you know what happened? Washington stopped the bloody saber rattling. Washington got the message. Just at the ability, just the decision of that government at that time to say, no, it's not in Australia's interest to agree to that. It took the heat right out of it. Can you imagine Albanese having the courage to do that right now? Just do what John Howard did. Albanese is supposed to be more radical and more anti-American and more, pro-independent than John Howard. But since 2017, things have shifted so much in this country. The Americans have got their fangs so deeply into this country with these bases. We have given up so much sovereignty, right, that it would cause a meltdown if Albanese said just exactly the same thing as Alexander Downer said in 2004. Now, he gave a speech the other day about independence, which, if he means it, he should back it up and say what I'm saying. But all I'm saying is that's what we need to do. There was we started a process with China in 1972 under Gough Whitlam. Every government from 1972, probably except the Gillard government because of what she did with Albert, but even up to Tony Abbott in 2014, every Australian government continued to develop the relationship with China because they saw that Australia having an economic relationship with China was in our independent national interest. It was none of the Americans' business. Malcolm Fraser said in his final interview in 2015, he made the point that in 1976, he took his first overseas trip as Prime Minister. He went to China, and he went to China so he could send a message to Asia that Australia embraces its home region. And he said, I also wanted to send a message to the British and the Americans that we are not going to be a colonial outpost for them. Right? We're going to act as an independent country and embrace our own region. That's what Malcolm Fraser said in 1976. Bob Hawke, Keating, all those guys built on from that. And that was the overarching policy until about 2017. And since 2017, we've gone crazy. And all I'm saying is if Albanese does what I said, we can go back to that, to where we went wrong in 2017 and continue on that path. Send a message to our part of the world and to the Americans that we're going to act independently. And by doing so, we might actually take the heat out of this, because if America can't rely on our support, is it worth doing? That's what I'm advocating.
Yeah, very interesting, Robbie. And of course, Albo and all the hangers-on are over there at the moment. Although actually I noticed that the media reporting is very weak. I'm not sure why that's so weak. I mean, the ABC is doing a little bit, but there isn't a lot of real coverage. But there is quite a lot of activity, and Albo is over there for quite a few days. He's having trade discussions and all of those things. And to my mind, that is a bit of a change in atmospherics compared with a few years ago, when there was almost no discussion between Australia and China at the official level.
Well, no, it's a very important development. But if you watch the way the media is reporting it here, especially the typical right wing media, it's just disgusting.
Yeah.
Chris Kenny is on Sky. He has a 5 o'clock show on Sky. He was characterizing Albanese today because he met Xi Jinping. Oh, Albanese is being rewarded for bowing the knee to the Chinese, blah blah blah, just because he's stabilized the relationship. And so when you hear that, you think, well, hang on, what industries do you want to lose again? Like, when I said earlier I met the Premier of Tasmania, I was at this event in Tasmania. I met a lobster grower, a lobster farmer. That guy is very happy. He's got his Chinese markets back. His top 10 markets are individual Chinese cities, and his 11th market is mainland Australia. His 12th market is Singapore. He's very happy he's got his market back. All the exporters are very happy they got their markets back. We called the Chinese reaction to, it wasn't just me saying Scott Morrison was being deliberately insulting. His colleague John Alexander said it on ABC, that Scott Morrison went out of his way to be deliberately insulting. You know why? Because Scott Morrison can make money now out of AUKUS. That's why he did it. That's why I quoted Alex Bristow before. This military-industrial complex part of this, cha-ching, 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 that's what corrupts these bastards so much. That as long as they're making money, they don't care that they're putting the world in danger of war. And to the people on there who are saying I should go to China before I talk about it, I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about Australia. If China, if you really believe China's Nazi Germany, then put your money where your bloody mouth is. You start a political movement like mine, and you go around there advocating we cut off all our trade with them. We should, if China is anything like Nazi Germany, some despotic, despicable place, why are we sending them all this iron ore so they can turn into weapons? You should be, don't have casual goddamn opinions about this, people. You should get out there and you should demand that we stop doing that, because we're putting the world at risk, right? Let's blow up our whole economy and do that. No, nobody does that, because you're all gutless cowards. You want to have these casual, cheap opinions that have been put in your head through a funnel by the bloody American and British propaganda networks, and you don't want to stop it. You don't want to look in the face that you've been duped. And the proof is because of how quickly public opinion changed on this in the matter of a decade, from what it was before. This is why I'm telling you about the continuum from 1972 to 2017. Right? That if all these different prime ministers in a row could build this relationship with this country, which we make a lot of money from, and the only reason that we're sabotaging it is because the people who have led that are these people funded by the Americans to do it, because they have a hard-on for, there's a school of thought in America, we better have a fight with China now, because if we wait 10 years, we'll never beat them. And that sort of thinking is evil. It needs to be eradicated from the world. America has no choice but to accept we're in a multipolar world, and they need to share power. And they just need to sit down at the table with these other countries, and they need to give them respect and work out how to do that. Right? And they don't want to do that because they're so full of their self-importance as a country. Oh, we need to be the top dog. And that's what's putting the world at risk. So I don't care that I don't know China. You can tell me that till you're blue in the face. I know Australia. I know America. I know what we have done on the world stage. I know the evil that we are perpetrating as we speak. And we think our shit don't stink. So cut it out. The day a war begins, Martin, while I'm on this rant, you interviewed me just a few days before Russia went into Ukraine. And I said, I got some things wrong in that interview, but I said to you in that interview, because we were saying, what's going to happen? Is it going to happen? And I said to you then something very important. Russia has given America a proposed treaty it wants America to agree to. America's response to that will determine what Russia does. And of course, the Americans just thumb their nose at it. No, we're not even going to listen. We're not even going to take Russia's concerns seriously. And then that went in. And then the Russians went in. Now, when that started, look what's happened subsequently, and look how hard it is to stop. Do we want to stop it? Would the Ukrainians want to stop it? Would the Russians want to stop it? Right? The whole world talks about it. Look how hard it is to stop. That's why you got to fight so hard to stop these wars before they start. Especially don't buy the bullshit that leads to war in the first place. And right now, if you can't see that this Elbridge Colby making these kind of demands for us, the fact he wants Albanese to have a conversation about it while he's in China is a provocation to the Chinese, and a signal to the Taiwanese that he's trying to stage the provocation that he said in his book he needs to justify a bloody war. And we in Australia should not be party to that. And if you are, piss off. Go to another country. You're not loyal Australians. If you're gunning for a war with China as well, seriously, piss off out of here. Seriously, this is garbage. This is utter garbage. Bill, whoever you are.
So I guess as we sort of come towards the end of the show, Robbie, we have an alignment with the US, which is shaky in some regards, but also very influential. We have an alignment with China that is actually trade based, and there are people over there trying to sort of extend the trade elements now. And I suppose the question is, do we try and keep both in a creative tension? Do we actually say, no, we actually want to find other partners and other parties too, or do we try and go it alone? No, we're a small country, a relatively small military. So it always seems to me we probably need some degree of mutuality in whatever we do. So there's an interesting policy question, isn't it, about which poodle do you go with, or which poodle are we, or do we actually try and grow up and not be a poodle anymore and try and go our own way?
The latter.
And if we go our own way, what does that actually mean in practice?
Okay, so let me calm down. I'll stop being provoked by the ignorant comments. Sorry, don't take offense at me calling you ignorant. I'm up for these kind of arguments all the time. Ask anyone who knows me. But anyway, look. So first of all, let's not be Pollyanna. A country should have defence, but I have an important argument about defence. A defence policy starts with an industry policy, and Australia's kidding itself. We don't have our own industry. The whole thing is premised on us buying, super expensive weapons from overseas. It's just a joke, right? We need a defence. We need an industry policy. Now, there's a great book how in World War II, the Japanese thought twice about actually invading. They bombed Darwin and Townsville, I think, but they thought twice about actually invading Australia, partly because we had this we had this defence industry official who was a British chemist, actually, A.E. Layton, if I remember. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. I might be confusing with someone else, but he had from like the late 20s onward, he had helped to supervise this genius idea where all of the industrial factories in Australia had annexes attached to them, where the machinery of the factories could be complemented by having machinery that could be used to make weapons, and the staff of the factories would be rotated through the annex where they could learn to operate those machines as well. And it just gave them this Australia like an industrial capacity that could be. The point of it was to have it be scaled up, and therefore, instead of thinking like the whole military industrial complex that this term, that Eisenhower warned about, it's premised on having permanent weapons manufacturers building stockpiles of weapons and looking for, creating wars that they could justify using them in, right? Whereas this was premised on, let's just have an ability to make what we need if we ever need it, but don't waste all resources until we need it. Like, you scale it up at the time. And apparently, according to this very authoritative account that we published a report on, it really did give the Japanese pause for thought. Plus everything else about Australia. As Australia is a hard place to invade and occupy. It is much cheaper for the Chinese to buy our resources than they'll ever be to invade and occupy us to steal them. Much cheaper to buy them. I mean, you just got to understand the economics of it. Joke. Anyway, so look, let's actually develop a proper defensive posture. You quoted Sam Roggeveen before from the Lowy Institute in one of those articles. Roggeveen said a couple of important things. One of the things he said, he made the observation the other day, with all this China threat talk, there's been no actual Australian Defence Force analysis of China as a threat. You would think someone would have done a proper report on it, but it's never been done. It's all just been talk. But the other thing is, he said he advocates what's called the Echidna strategy. Make ourselves harder to attack, and that's think of other weapons, missiles and drones or whatever. Anyway, see, look, so I'm not being accused of being a Pollyanna. Now you've got to have some thought about that. But then look at the world differently. And the world is, if you take out the white parts, the Europeans, the Americans, the Canadians, and the New Zealanders and Australias, 3/4 of the world are on a completely different wavelength. They're the ones that they're queuing up to join the BRICS and other arrangements. There's a thing called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that covers most of Eurasia, and they're all members of that. All the countries in that region are members of that. and it's both security and economic cooperation. ASEAN is a brilliant one in our own area with Indonesia, etc. And we should be doing a lot more in that. And all these things emphasize the benefits of economic cooperation primarily and security secondarily, whereas we are obsessed with security. The first line of security should be our diplomacy. I've got to know diplomats, in my political career. I reckon they're brilliant. They're very, very good. Send them in to the room and let them sort it out. Give them actual backup. But in Australia, the Defence Department has a budget that's like 100 times the Foreign Affairs Department, right? We're not serious about diplomacy. We know that our most important, the country we need to have the most important relationship with, because it is the one country that could threaten us, is Indonesia. We treat them like garbage. Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, always takes his first trip to Indonesia, but what in practice do we actually do? That's why the Indonesians were the first to complain about AUKUS. Do you know we have this horribly discriminatory visa policy towards Indonesia? The poor Indonesian people find it impossible to get a visitor visa to come to Australia. We treat them like they're all about to invade us. They're not interested in invading us. The Indonesians, like many countries that have big populations, they've got serious about, okay, we've got to do things to economically develop ourselves and build up our living standards. And they're starting to be quite successful at it. They've built a brilliant fast train, high-speed train from Jakarta to somewhere 3 hours away, and we haven't even done anything yet, right? We haven't even done a damn thing. Anyway, so the bottom line is, stop being a poodle, but stop thinking about balance of power. Do we balance the Chinese off with the Americans? No. We've got to bring the whole world to the same table and say, look, what we've got in common is more than what divides us, right? The benefits of economic development, if we can cooperate on that, trade our surpluses and our strengths, share our strengths with each other, right? Help uplift the continent of Africa, and that's what China's doing, and it's been demonized for doing it, but the Africans love it. Right? The amount of investment that China's pouring in there, and you'll see these, after 50 years of the IMF banging in there with corporations looting the joint, the Chinese go in there, and so you get a blizzard of non-stop articles from the Americans about how the Chinese are exploiting Africa, etc. No, but when these stupid Western politicians go to Africa and they carry on about it, a lot of these African leaders are now they got the moxie to put them in their place and say, don't come and lecture us about this. We, for the first time, we're actually benefiting from investment rather than colonial looting. We need to be doing that kind of investment here in Australia. Donald Trump, I probably said this to you last time, Martin. Donald Trump's done this crazy things with tariffs. Right now, tariffs are not always crazy. I mean, there's a purpose for tariffs. But he's just like disrupted the whole world, thinking that somehow this is all going to land in a way that makes America great again. He would have been much better off, in my view, starting a massive investment program in American high-speed rail, right? Which doesn't have 1 centimeter of high-speed rail. China has 50,000 kilometers of it and growing. He would have been much better off doing that, sourcing the steel locally as much as they could. They still might have had to import some, but start rebuilding America's industries that way through actual investment, right? And actually, create real jobs and etc. Instead, he's turned the place into a bloody hellhole. Whereas fundamentally, one of the things that we do know about China, even though I've never been there, you can tell you can actually understand how the economic policy works. China has perfected what we advocate for Australia, which is a mixture of communism or socialism and capitalism, right? Allow free enterprise, incentivize free enterprise, encourage free enterprise, but keep a framework around it where you make sure the investments that are needed are done that uplift everybody. And it's been very successful compared to our laissez-faire neoliberal economies. And we should learn from that, and we should apply that here. And it's a good sort of parallel to how foreign policy should be run as well, right? Where the world says, the world can say through existing forums, including the United Nations, look, this is what we should be collaborating on. Here's international law. We're all going to agree to uphold it, but let's prioritize cooperation around economic development to uplift all of humanity, right? Rather than allowing some rogue states who are determined to make money for their militaries keep starting wars.
Yeah, and I think this whole idea of the military-industrial complex becoming effectively a self-fulfilling, neoliberal model once again, just saying we're going to build more and sell more and build more and sell more. Well, guess what? There are shareholders who are actually benefiting from that. And I think that's the other point that I would come back to. We need to stand back and just think, so who are the winners and who are the losers in the current way that things are set up? And the point is there are alternative paths, but they require a very different way of thinking. And to my mind, it comes back to fundamentally just saying, no, this neoliberal philosophy that underpins so much today is actually leading us into a very dark future, but it doesn't have to be that way. Robbie, I want to say thank you. Great conversation tonight. Just to tell you that the poll, which I will end now, said pivot towards the US more, 19%, pivot towards China more, 10%, pivot look beyond China and the US, 15%, but 56% said deliberately own our own destiny. So I can tell you that in the show tonight, there are a lot of people who are thinking, yeah, we should step up and definitely take ownership of this more than just looking over the road or over the pond, as it were, for somebody else to do it for us.
Can I say, for those people that are still having pot shots at me on the chat, follow me on Twitter and we'll continue the conversation there, because you're being very provocative, and I find it hard not to bite back. We're running out of time.
Yeah, well, we could go on for another couple of hours, but I ain't going to do that, Robbie. I think I should let you go because it's late in the evening there, and they've had a hard day. But I really appreciate you coming on again and sharing your thoughts with us. These are issues which will go on and will become ever more important. So we'll definitely pick them up again and have another show later on. Robbie, if people want to find out more about you, where do they go?
So website is citizensparty.org.au, and you can watch our weekly show, The Citizens Report, on YouTube, and on Twitter I'm at Robbie Barwick, ROBBIEBARWICK. But I'm also on I'm on TikTok now. If you're partial to a bit of TikTok, and then the TikTok's fun. I've gone viral a few times. I think my best show was 150,000 views or something. I do it. You'd like it, Martin, because I cram one of my rants into like 2 or 3 minutes instead of 15 or 20 like on your show, like tonight. Sorry about that. Okay, see, I'm getting distracted by these comments. So AI, no, get on Twitter and we'll duke it out there. But it's not about China, mate. It's about America and us.
Yeah.
Anyway,
it is ultimately about the future of Australia and Australians.
That's
and
right.
That's what I think we need to focus on. Robbie, thank you very much. Have a good evening. I'm going to take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show. So take care. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Martin.
There you go. Well, I think that was definitely a good ventilation of some very important issues. Thank you for sticking with us a little bit over time, but I think it was worth it this evening. Just to say that next week, Leith Van Onselen will be back on, and we're going to be talking about those economic statistics and the housing and all of those sorts of things. The dogs are still here. Well, sort of. They're a bit stretched out, but there you go. They've been quite quiet today, which is good. So thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Thank you for the super chat there, Jason. Appreciate that as well. And for all of those who made comments in the chat and took the time to take the poll as well. Really appreciate that. We'll look forward to seeing you next week on another live show. And of course, I'll be publishing my daily shows in the meantime. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Take care. We'll see you next time. Bye.